Question 12, not question 2. Question 12 focuses on the new right and new left theories that came out of the post-war period of you remember in the post-war period there was a substantial amount of agreement of political ideologies, and then this was followed by increasing polarization during the Cold War in the 1960s. And so there's some particular ideas that come out of this period, such as the overloaded government and the end of ideology, among other things. So this question says, in the post-World War II period, there was a polarization of political ideals, and many theorists began rethinking the nature of Western democracies and the role of the state. Discuss some of the ideas that come out of this period by considering at least 2 of the following questions. So here I'm asking you to look at at least 2 of these questions. Explain what was meant by the end of ideology and one-dimensional man. What are the common threads in the overloaded government and legitimation crisis theories? What do new right theorists, so Hayek and Nozick, argue against? What is the enemy? What important dimensions of modern politics do their analyses omit? What are the elements and implications of the model of legal democracy? What are the ideas that come out of the new left, so McPherson and Pateman? What are the new left criticisms of Marxism? What do the ideas of the new left owe to liberalism? So these are all ideas that come in the mid to late 20th century. You'll remember that in Chapter 7, Held is describing 2 models of democracy that are the result of a perception of a crisis in liberal democracy. And so those 2 models are legal democracy and participatory democracy. So to get at these models, he examines the historical context of the post-war era, dividing it into 2 distinct periods, roughly before and after 1965, in which there were differing levels of economic performance, differing political consequences, and, at least from the view of academic observers, differing sense of explanatory theories of these differences. So in the before and pre-1965 period, they're coming to terms with the events of World War II, fascism, the Holocaust, and then dealing with Reconstruction. Then you have the post-war boom, so the return of the soldiers and all the social changes that came along with this, in terms of women's rights, full employment, home ownership, cars, and so on. You have the baby boom, the advent of teenagers, and the growth of a youth culture. Internationally, you have the end of colonial rule in African countries. You have the start of the Cold War. The Korean War starts and ends, and then the Vietnam War begins. So it's not, even though World War II is over, there's still a lot going on. But in spite of that, there was this feeling of political consensus and stability, which leads to this end of ideology theory. And then in the post-1965 era, things become sort of turned upside down. So you have the Cold War and the Vietnam War continuing. There's a lot of social changes happening with the swinging 60s, the contraception, more women entering the workforce, gay rights, schools and higher education explode, and so on. We have the end of the baby boom. Women are working. There's, as I mentioned, birth control. We have the erosion of political consensus, which leads to what was seen as a crisis in liberal democracy. So we start to see more polarization in the period. And we start to see theories about an overloaded government and a legitimation crisis. So you should be able to understand and explain what those terms are referring to. So legal democracy is about this idea of trying to understand how individuals can be protected from arbitrary government and how liberty can be maintained. It's called legal democracy because it was based on this idea that the rule of law is needed in order to limit majority rule, to make sure there's not that abuse of power. And so legal democracy comes out of the new right, or neoliberalism, or neoconservatism. All of those terms mean generally the same kind of thing. And here in this view, it's up to the individual to succeed without any supports from the government. So it's a fight against the idea of big government. So the free market theory or the laissez-faire market theory is applied to all areas of life, not just the economy. And like I said, it is an advocacy for minimal state involvement in the economy and the provision of opportunities. So where child support payments became used in the Depression years, people start to attack that as saying we don't need that anymore. So there's an idea that we don't need the government to provide the social safety nets that we're used to seeing today. There was a limiting of the powers of groups such as unions as well as advocacy groups. Strong government was needed to enforce law and order. And Robert Nozick is one of the ones that builds on Locke's ideas about the state of nature rights and libertarianism. So the idea is that the state should protect your rights, not that it should support you in any kind of way. Hayek noted the fundamental dangers in mass democracies, and because of those fundamental dangers, he argued that laws should be enacted to limit arbitrary political power. On the new left side in this period is the participatory democracy model. So the new left asks the question, can individuals be truly free and equal in contemporary liberal democracies when inequalities due to race, class, and gender persist and limit people's ability to participate in a democracy? And so Carol Pateman is one of the main theorists here who argued for a clear separation between the state and civil society, or argued that a clear separation was not possible between state and civil society, that the two must go hand in hand. So the state has to be democratized by making sure the institutions are more open and accountable. And she argues for, she identifies new forms of struggle at the local level through things like factory-based politics, the women's movement, ecological groups, and so on. And she believes that these new forms of struggle will help to ensure that society and the state have the appropriate amount of accountability. C.B. Macpherson is another advocate for participatory democracy, and he argued that it would lead to a more democratic future. Now, question 13 is about the post-Soviet era, and there's a few possible options for answering question 13 on the nature of democracy after the collapse of communism in Eastern and Central Europe and the fall of the Soviet Union. And so this question says, at the end of the 1980s and the start of the 1990s, there was a series of revolutions in Central and Eastern Europe that stimulated a revival in thinking about democracy and a celebration of the ideal of liberal democracy. So I want you to think about why this period was important to new thinking about the nature and future of democratic ideas. And then you can consider one or more of the questions that I have listed there. One says, Held argues that the main threat to liberty is inequality. And why is this true? What does Fukuyama mean by the end of history? What does Kalanickos mean by saying that liberalism has broken its promises? Why does Held write that the, quote, appeal and nature of democracy itself remains inadequately considered by both Fukuyama and Kalanickos? In what ways can the traditions of liberalism and socialism be found lacking or wanting, according to Held, if you look at them from the point of view of democracy? So after Soviet communism, you'll remember that Francis Fukuyama makes this argument after the events of 1989. Francis Fukuyama argued that with the triumph of liberalism over the main ideological rival, so the Soviet Union, we had reached the end of history. In other words, the political victory of democracy marks the last stage of our political evolution. So I want you to think about why he would make this argument, what the critiques are that he makes, and do they make sense? But also, what are your critiques of his argument? Similarly, with Alex Kalanikos, he makes this argument that liberal democracy has broken its promises regarding political participation, accountable government, and the freedom to protest and reform government. And so he comes up with this democratic alternative of democracy from below, so a grassroots type of democracy. And he also makes the point that Marxism is not the same as Leninism and Stalinism. Stalinism was anti-democratic. It was a state capitalist regime, and it was an authoritarian distortion of Marxism. And I think that's an important point to remember when you're thinking about Marxism. He makes the argument that the revolutions of 1989 were not a triumph of democracy, rather they were a triumph of capitalism. So it was just a reorganization of the ruling classes. And in some of the countries, you can look and see that really the countries are not more democratic than they were previously. And there's some critiques of his argument as well. Now, Held argues that both liberalism and Marxism are lacking in some fundamental ways, in particular regarding how to define the good life in contemporary politics. Fukuyama believes that the good life is the result of seeing the modern world as based on liberal principles. He says that political and economic life should be a matter of individual freedom and initiative, for example. And then Kalanikos, a classic Marxist, defend the desirability of certain social or collective goals and means. They understand equality and liberty to be best realized not by individuals left to their own devices in a free market, but rather we need to have the ideals of equality and liberty, and that they can only be achieved by working together. So a more collective view of things. And this might mean struggling to ensure that the means of production are socialized. Now, Held concludes that both Fukuyama and Kalanikos fail to adequately take into consideration the appeal and nature of democracy itself. And so you can think about whether or not you agree with Held, or if you think that Fukuyama and Kalanikos are more convincing. In the end, though, modern political life tends to be legitimized by the label of democracy, not necessarily considering the conditions of political regimes and the quality of democracy. So we need to think about, how we're using the idea of democracy. I'll pause here and we'll continue with question number 14 in another video.